She was Hollywood's most enduring star, a woman who clawed her way from poverty to become one of cinema's most iconic figures. But behind Joan Crawford's perfectly sculpted image lay secrets so dark, so deeply buried, that even decades after her death, the truth continues to shock those who dare to uncover it. Tonight, we pull back the velvet curtain on Hollywood's golden age to reveal the woman Joan Crawford really wasn't the price she paid to become a legend. What you're about to discover will forever change how you see one of cinema's greatest stars. Joan Crawford wasn't born, she was created. The woman the world knew as Joan Crawford began life as Lucille Fay LeSueur in San Antonio, Texas in 1904. But even this origin story was carefully crafted mythology. The truth about her early years was far more tragic and complex than Hollywood's publicity machine ever dared reveal. Growing up in grinding poverty, Lucille experienced a childhood that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Her father abandoned the family when she was barely 10 years old, leaving her mother, Annabelle Johnson, to struggle as a single parent with multiple children. What happened next would shape every relationship Joan Crawford would ever have, a pattern of abandonment and desperate need for control that would define both her legendary career and her most destructive personal moments. The young Lucille was shuffled between relatives, often treated more like a burden than a beloved child. She witnessed her mother's relationships with a series of men who brought temporary stability but inevitably disappeared, leaving the family in even more desperate circumstances. These early experiences of instability and abandonment would later manifest in Crawford's obsessive need to control every aspect of her life and career. But perhaps most significantly, it was during these formative years that Lucille learned her most valuable and dangerous skill, the art of reinvention. She discovered that by changing her story, her mannerisms, even her name, she could become whoever she needed to be to survive. This ability would eventually make her a star, but it would also trap her in a prison of her own making, where the real woman beneath the carefully constructed facade slowly disappeared. By the time she arrived in Hollywood in the early 1920s, Lucille LeSueur had already begun the process of erasing herself. She would spend the rest of her life perfecting this disappearing act, creating Joan Crawford, a woman so perfectly manufactured for stardom that she would overshadow and ultimately consume the vulnerable girl who had dreamed of escape from a life of poverty and abandonment. When Louis B. Mayer first laid eyes on the young dancer, calling herself Lucille LeSueur, he saw something that would make Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer millions: raw ambition wrapped in stunning beauty. But what Mayer created in his Star Factory would become something far more complex and ultimately more destructive than even he could have imagined. The transformation began immediately. MGM's publicity department went to work crafting the perfect backstory, erasing the poverty and dysfunction of Lucille's real childhood and replacing it with a more palatable narrative of small-town American dreams. They changed her name through a fan magazine contest. Joan Crawford was born not from love or family tradition, but from corporate marketing strategy. Under MGM's, Crawford learned to walk, talk, and think like a star. She was taught which emotions to display and which to hide, how to angle her face for the cameras, and most crucially, how to make audiences believe that the woman they were watching on screen was real. The studio's acting coaches, publicity handlers, and image consultants worked tirelessly to eliminate any trace of Lucille's authentic self. But the MGM machine demanded more than just professional transformation. It required complete surrender of personal autonomy. Crawford's relationships, her public appearances, even her private conversations were monitored and managed by the studio. She learned to see herself through the lens of public perception, constantly adjusting and refining her image to match what audiences wanted to see. But this intense focus on image over authenticity created a psychological split that would plague Crawford for the rest of her life. She became expert at presenting different versions of herself for different audiences: the glamorous movie star, the devoted mother, the professional colleague, the romantic partner. But in the process, she began to lose track of who she really was beneath all these carefully constructed personas. The studio system that made Joan Crawford also broke her in ways that wouldn't become apparent until decades later. The constant pressure to maintain perfection, the inability to show weakness or vulnerability, and the complete control over her personal life created a psychological powder keg that would eventually explode in the most private spaces of her life: her relationships with her children and closest companions. Joan Crawford's perfectionism wasn't just a personality trait. It was a survival mechanism that eventually became her prison. Those who worked closely with her described an almost supernatural attention to detail that bordered on the pathological. Every aspect of her appearance, her home, her public image, had to be flawless, and she would go to terrifying lengths to maintain this impossible standard. Her makeup routine alone was legendary for its precision and duration. Crawford would spend hours each day applying and reapplying her makeup, studying her reflection from every angle, searching for imperfections that only she could see. She carried multiple compact mirrors and would check her appearance obsessively, even in the middle of conversations. Friends and colleagues learned never to interrupt this ritual. as the consequences could be swift and devastating. This obsession extended far beyond her physical appearance. Crawford's homes were showcases of perfection, with every object placed precisely, every surface polished to gleaming perfection. Staff members were given detailed instructions about how to arrange flowers, fold towels, and even stack magazines. Those who failed to meet her exacting standards were dismissed immediately, often without explanation. But it was in her professional life that Crawford's perfectionism reached its most intense expression. She would rehearse scenes dozens of times, memorizing not just her own lines but those of every other actor in the production. She studied her rushes obsessively, analyzing every gesture and expression. Directors learned that working with Crawford meant accepting her need to control every aspect of her performance, from costume choices to camera angles. The psychological toll of maintaining such impossibly high standards was enormous. Crawford suffered from chronic insomnia, often lying awake for hours, analyzing the day's events and planning for perfection in the days ahead. She became increasingly isolated, unable to form genuine relationships with people who might see through her carefully constructed facade. Perhaps most tragically, this perfectionism became the weapon she would later turn on those closest to her, particularly her adopted children. The same standards of flawless appearance and behavior that she demanded from herself, she would impose on them with devastating consequences that would only come to light years later. While the public saw Joan Crawford as Hollywood's ultimate romantic leading lady, the reality of her personal relationships was far more complex and often deeply troubled. Her four marriages told a story of a woman desperately seeking love and stability but ultimately sabotaging every chance at genuine intimacy through her need for control and her terror of vulnerability. Her first marriage to Douglas Fairbanks Jr. in 1929 seemed like a Hollywood fairy tale. The young, handsome son of one of cinema's biggest stars and the rising starlet appeared to be the perfect couple. But behind the glamorous public appearances, their relationship was marked by Crawford's increasing attempts to control and mold Fairbanks into her idea of the perfect husband. She monitored his friendships, critiqued his career choices, and demanded that he conform to her vision of what their marriage should look like. Fairbanks later described living with Crawford as like being married to a beautiful, perfectly calibrated machine. Every spontaneous moment was analyzed and often criticized. Every gesture of affection had to meet her standards of romantic perfection. The young man who had fallen in love with her beauty and ambition found himself suffocating under the weight of her impossible expectations. The pattern would repeat itself through each subsequent marriage. Actor Fran Chatone, her second husband, initially seemed to understand and even appreciate Crawford's drive for perfection. But he too eventually found himself trapped in a relationship where genuine emotion was constantly being edited and refined. Crawford's need to control extended to their most intimate moments, turning their marriage into a performance that neither could sustain. Her marriage to Philip Terry was perhaps the most tragic, as it coincided with Crawford's decision to adopt children. Terry witnessed firsthand how Crawford's perfectionism and control issues extended to her parenting, but his attempts to intervene were met with such fierce resistance that their marriage quickly deteriorated. Even her final marriage to Pepsi-Cola executive Alfred Steele, which, by all accounts, was her happiest, was marked by Crawford's inability to fully trust or surrender control. She loved Steele deeply, but she could never stop performing the role of the perfect wife, even in the privacy of their home. The decision to adopt children seemed to represent Joan Crawford's ultimate attempt at creating the pay